Hello, Christ Community Church. This is a quick video review of what we've been doing in the Wednesday evening fellowship, Bible study, and prayer times that we do virtually. I want to let you know that the time of these has changed to 7 p.m. and the link will be provided as to how to get into the gathering. This is so you can catch up on what we've done there. So we do a bit of chatting when we first log in, and we check in with each other, how things are going, see if there's any news. Then we move to an opening prayer, and then we go to our Bible study time. And we are looking at the Gospel of John, the Gospel story as John writes it. And what I started with was, you could call it a theory or a belief or an understanding that the first 18 verses of the Gospel of John, so chapter 1, verses 1 to at least 14, but maybe also to 18, is like an outline. It's like an overture in a musical piece where the themes, the patterns of the music, the melody are laid out, and then they're going to be expanded and played with later on. And so we've gone through in our first gathering, we went through those verses and we wrote down what we thought the themes might just be, and we noticed some interesting things. Now, if you want, you can turn off the video, pause the video at this point and read those verses and make some notes for yourself. But if you're just wanting the Coles Notes version, I'm going to run through them. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to figure out how to show the list on the screen once the video is recorded. So I'm just going to read it off to you now. So in verses 1 to 3, we immediately have the theme of the Word. And if you know something, you do some reading on this or learn some things about the Greek and the Hebrew and philosophy at that time, what John is doing here is he's combining the Hebrew word dabar with the Greek philosopher's word logos. And there's a whole interesting meaning to be made of that. But he introduces that one combination word here, the word, and he introduces it and he begins to describe that word. And we recognize that there's a clear echo of Genesis 1 in what John writes here and how he writes it. And then he also in those verses points out that the Word created everything. Then in verses 4 and 5, there's this theme of life and light. And they seem to be kind of tied together somehow in a way that should intrigue us. What's the connection? And he talks about the struggle between light and darkness, the physical and the spiritual, you could say as well, the material and the spiritual. And there too are echoes of Genesis 1. It looks like he's continuing his echo of Genesis 1 with some variation from that. Then in verses 6 to 9, the main theme we identify there is witness or testify. And it's made clear in verse 8 where we start to see that John the baptizer and John the gospel writer are both people who are pointing to Jesus, who are testifying or witnessing to Jesus. There's also in here, back to the philosophical side, hints at enlightenment or spiritual light. So that theme remains there kind of in the background. In verses 10 to 13, John talks about how the Word came to his own kind, but wasn't recognized, was not received by his own, but others did receive, and they became children of God by a different kind of birth. That might have you already thinking ahead to a story that is in John of Nicodemus. And so the implication here is this is nothing to do with DNA, but it is a spiritual kind of birth, a spiritual kind of heritage. Now, this would not have been heard as friendly by the Jews, since they took some pride in the fact of the lineage from Abraham. And so for John to be writing that lineage like that, DNA was not going to matter anymore That would have been troubling. And then in verse 14, the word became physical human stuff, is what you could say, because stuff is the word that's really used for what Adam and Eve are created from as well. Physical human stuff. This word, this philosophical concept, became human stuff. And it tented or camped or tabernacled among us. Those words have the sense of temporariness. It traveled among us, passing through. Then the theme of glory that has been seen, and the theme of the one and only who is full of grace and truth. So you could stop with those, but I'll go to 15 and to 18 as well, where we get again the theme of testifying. John testifies about the blessing, and that's another sub-theme in here. Blessing received, grace and truth is mentioned again, and then God made known is kind of a punctuation on this whole section. So those are the themes that we've identified that I know I'm excited about, because when you read further in the gospel, there are places where these themes come back and you don't necessarily recognize it unless you know the overture. So for instance, the story of Nicodemus is a very key example, where Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night in the dark. So there's the dark and light theme. And he's what we would say in the dark as to what Jesus is talking about. And he's stuck believing in it's only material when Jesus is actually speaking spiritually. And so when you just read that story, John doesn't put pointers there saying, here's my themes, but when we know the overture, we can read that story differently. Then the second time we met, we compared Genesis 1 and John 1, because we had seen those echoes. And so there too, you can pause the video and you can read them side by side and look for parallels, look for things that are the same or very much the same but slightly different, and you'll see some interesting patterns. If you want to do that, pause now and do that. Now I'll quickly run through, and again, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to show the document on the screen or the PowerPoint, but in verse 1 of Genesis 1, you have already in the beginning God. And John 1 starts with in the beginning was the Word. And he does say the Word was God, so he ties it to this. So there's a clear sign of the echo. In Genesis 1b, God created the heavens and the earth. The word created is there. And in John 1 verse 3, the word made is there 3 times, an echo of the creation idea. So we read in John 1:3, through him all things were made, without him nothing was made that has been made. Echo. And so it should raise for us the question, why is John echoing this, and what's he doing in echoing it? In Genesis 1 verse 2b, darkness was over the face of the deep. And in 2c, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. In John 1:4, we read, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And so as the parallel goes on, there seems to be an interesting thing that he's setting up here. Now, I believe that he's hinting back at Genesis that there was a spiritual darkness over the deep, and the Spirit of God is equated with the light. We'll get into that further later on. Then in Genesis 1 verse 3, we read, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And in John 1:5, we read, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The darkness cannot cancel the light. It can't overrule the light. So John's doing some very interesting things here, and that's where I argue that that John chapter 1 is also creation 2.0, where John is telling the story of creation, but with new layers of meaning woven into it that come from understanding what Jesus was all about. And so looking back through that lens, John writes something that would have had relevance and interest to Greek philosophers and to Hebrew scholars both. So that's what we've done so far. And for the next one, we plan to look starting at verse 19 of John. And I believe, I'm going off the top of my head here, it's to verse 35. And we're going to now take the pattern of the overture and we're going to start reading and looking for the overture themes coming back. There you go. Now you're up to date. If you see this video, you will have some idea of what we've done, and we'll be able to participate without being concerned about catching up or what are these people talking about, and those kinds of things. Till we meet again, shalom and surrender.